Midnight. A London basement that smells like wet wool and old paper. A single bulb swings a lazy circle over a table that looks more like a butcher's block than a desk. Pens, knives. A tin of black shoe polish. A suitcase with a false bottom. And in the corner, a battered icebox humming its quiet, necessary hymn. Two men, exhausted, jacketless, sleeves damp from the elbows down, stand with their palms pressed flat to cool metal, as if steadying themselves before a confession. They are going to lie to an empire. NBUT first. They have to give a stranger a life. NHI's name is not his name. On the paper, in tight-looped ink, he becomes Major William Martin, Royal Marines. He acquires a date of birth, a service number, a blood type. He acquires a mustache in a photograph, the bored expression of a man who has learned how to endure meetings. He acquires pockets, bus tickets, a laundrette stub, a key with no door to open, a silver cross that looks like something his mother might have posted in a small box when the news in the papers grew darker. In the breast pocket, he acquires a wallet with scuffed corners and the shy smell of leather. In the wallet, folded, handled, refolded, he acquires a letter from a woman who calls herself Pam. And Pam is a fiction with warmth. She writes like someone just learning to be brave. I bought you the socks we saw in that little shop by the park. They are very silly, and I expect you to wear them. Everyone will look at you. The sentence tilts and wobbles like someone laughing while they write. A lipstick kiss smeared in one corner turns thin cream paper into proof. Her second letter scolds him for losing a theater ticket and promises to be cross until he proves he didn't. She adds a postscript that isn't a postscript at all. It's the whole point. Hurry back. NTHE men mixing the glue and cutting the corners of this life are not artists, and they're not thieves, but they share an artist's patience and a thief's nerve. They argue over which pub's matchbook would be in a Marine's pocket in April, whether the mud on his trousers should be yesterday's or last week's, whether the ink on a bank receipt would bleed if it got wet. One writes a letter from a bank, correctly pompous. Another, with more wicked joy than a man is supposed to bring to war, crafts a nasty note from a hotel about a bill. You will appreciate that we cannot extend credit indefinitely, the note says, because even lies need reasonable inconveniences. The fiction must sweat. NTHE box in the corner contains the body whose lungs will persuade an empire. He is a Welshman, soft-faced in stillness, pulled from a London morgue with quiet permission and a small promise that his body will serve in death as he could not serve in life. His name is not recorded in the file the audience gets to read, which is one more indignity war insists on. He died alone. He will be buried with flags. And a courier arrives with a locked pouch and a content that doesn't exist. Letters between men whose signatures move divisions and ships. The letters say the thing they must never say, except in a way that can be found. That the next Allied invasion will not fall where the Germans expect it. It will not pour onto Sicily like water downhill. It will go to Greece and Sardinia. Sicily is camouflage. Greece is the blow. NEXCEPT, of course, that is itself camouflage. The blow will be Sicily. The plan is simple and criminal. The body, dressed as Major Martin, rank casual, tie slightly wrong the way non-naval officers always get it, will be dropped into the sea near Spain's southern coast. Monocled Spain, neutral on paper, generous with the Gestapo off paper, is a perfect echo chamber. The tide will do what tides always did before men began telling them to stop. The body will wash ashore. A fisherman, there is always a fisherman, in fables and in war, will tow him in. The local authorities will do the dance with Madrid, who will do the dance with the Germans, who will do a worse dance with themselves. Meanwhile, in London, men will sit on their hands and pretend to be furious, so the Germans can trust the theater's lighting and not see the barn. NBUT, the body must be believable. Death from hypothermia and drowning writes its own signatures in the blood and the lungs. The men in the basement, not doctors, still understand there are ways a body tells the truth after men have stopped. The icebox hums. The room breathes in ragged unison. A razor scrapes a cheek dead to sensation. The fake identity is clipped to the inside of a coat that smells faintly of the cedar of a cupboard and the sin of a department store. NTHE Day, they fly the body out. The weather pretends to help. When the door of the small aircraft opens over the Spanish coast, the air cuts everything in half. A pilot looks backward and nods. Two men do the terrible work of holding a dead person with gentleness. The sea below is a gray page waiting for ink. They tip the stretcher. The body becomes a dark comma in the ocean and begins to float away from the truth. It's April, 5 months before Sicily will receive the kind of attention Sicily has been built to withstand since Romans threw first stones. In Berlin, in a gray palace where light serves like a thing bullied, men with egos as high as radio towers are certain that the next blow will cross the shortest water. It's what they do. It's what the enemy must do if the enemy is rational. But a man in Madrid who has an appointment with a cigarette and with history shows a leather wallet to a man in a suit, who shows it to a man in a uniform, who shows it to a man who speaks to Berlin in sentences that end with clicks. NTHE letters arrive in hands that have considered the consequences of reading and have decided curiosity is a virtue. Wax is heated, then cooled. Seals are cut, then pressed again. The paper warms in light and in guilt. The fake bank letter is glanced at and dismissed, too human to interest officers who believe money is soil, not water. Pam's lipstick kiss brings an embarrassed smile in a room that has forgotten the function of joy. And then the letter that matters is lifted free. It is coded in plain English, the code that lies in syntax, and in what a man assumes he has the right to overhear. It discusses an invasion in a voice that sounds like men flatterers flatter. Your Greek adventure, one friend teases another, and the room in Madrid finds itself populated by men who want to believe that friends at this level tease. They read Greece and think, oh-ho. They read Sardinia and think, insurance. They read Sicily and think, red herring. The mind is its own accomplice when it has a wish. In London, the phone rings in an office painted the color of spoiled cream. The voice is calm. They've bit, it says. A partitioned world leans 6 degrees and holds. Men pretend to panic. They draft furious demands for the return of the diplomatic pouch. They send an officer to Spain to scold handsomely and be seen scolding. A famous admiral performs outrage in such perfect cadence that actors would do well to study his vowels. The Spanish, elegant professionals at the dance of information, do their part by smiling at the theater and then forgetting where they put their top hats. In Berlin, a general who has never cleared his own plate nods at the map as if the map works for him. Greece, he says, tasting the word like a vintage. He's older than his uniform likes to pretend. He remembers the winter mountains and what it means to sledge supplies into a place that doesn't want you. But he also remembers the Mediterranean as a chessboard, and the islands look like stepping stones laid just for his armies. Boots. He calls for reinforcements. Sicily, he thinks, will be ugly but not urgent. The real game will be the Balkans. In the headquarters of a very specific quiet service in London, someone pours tea into cups that have lost the gilding on their lips. He sets the tray down on a file labeled with a name that is not a name. He says, almost gently, "This is robbery in broad daylight." The other man nods. He writes a single sentence that his grandchildren will never read. Stage managing the enemy's fear is now our strongest arm. Meanwhile, the body of Major Martin lies in a Spanish morgue while powerful men argue over manners. A local doctor, honest and unimportant, puts a stethoscope to silence, because that is what a doctor does in every room. He examines the lungs and sees seawater where seawater belongs in drownings. He writes a certificate. It means one funeral here, thousands avoided elsewhere. A priest stands over a coffin too light for what it carries. and says a prayer large enough to hold 3 parts truth and 2 parts theft. NTHE thing about great lies is that they have to be held in the mouth like a language, not swallowed, not spat. Madrid holds the lie so well, Berlin tastes it perfectly. A courier travels with a briefcase that smells of polish and heat. He does not know the importance of the paper under his palm. He has been trained not to ask. The paper knows too much and says only what it should. Greece, Sardinia. The message is a mirror held up to a man whose vanity loves to be flattered by the mirror's shape. Not a listening post buried in English countryside where the wind speaks in wheat. Someone picks up Berlin's breath as it turns into orders. The code is broken not with fairy dust, but with pencils and repetition, and the cruel patience of women who learn to measure their worth in the number of lines typed each day. They type it up. They deliver it with the quiet triumph of people who know victory seldom looks like fireworks. Repositioning Luftwaffe units to Athens. Reserves redeployed to the Peloponnese. Sardinian defenses elevated. Each line is an exhale in a room where men have been holding their chests too high for too long. NHOW, do you measure a deception? Not in laughter. No one laughs out loud in the offices where war is numbers and names. You measure it in tonnage diverted, in planes that fly the wrong way, in ships that steam at night to ports that will be irrelevant by morning. You measure it in German generals writing to other German generals with the certainty of competent men misled by their own competence. Enemy feint at Sicily likely. Main effort to the east. None of this will seem like a miracle to the men in the landing craft, who will ride green waves toward Sicilian sand with throats burning from diesel. They will not feel lighter because someone in a suit stole gravity from their night. They will only feel cold, then hot. Then the ancient particular of fear and obedience. But the guns arranged to meet them will be fewer. The aircraft that might have flamed their lanes will be looking east. The mines will be there in ungenerous quantities, but the second and third lines behind the beaches will have seams where seams are needed. NTHE man whose wallet carried Pam's kiss is buried properly now, his false name on real stone. His grave is tended by people who value the grass above him and the quiet that tries to keep it green. Visitors come and read and cry without knowing exactly why. They leave coins, which is a human tick as old as rivers. Some weep because the harshest truth has a beautiful twin, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a stranger is to make sure he keeps meaning something after he is no longer here. Back in London, the men who started this lie do what professional liars in wartime always do after a success. They look for a larger truth to aim their next falsehood at. The war requires more. Greece will fall by other hands later, to other purposes. The deception must stretch beyond this one sea. They begin to whisper about Normandy and about a phantom army commanded by a real peacock, a man who could convince his own reflection to applaud. They begin to dream bolder dreams about inflatable tanks and radio nets chattering to themselves on empty fields, about top-secret divisions with names that would fool a schoolboy and therefore fool a colonel, NBUT that is later. For now, Sicily waits, blotched on maps with colors bureaucrats chose when they thought they'd be retired by now. The convoy gathers. American ships whose decks smell like paint and coffee. Royal Navy hulls that carry centuries of weather in their rivets. Liberty ships that look like factories went to sea. The men who will go ashore write letters they will never mail because the censors would blue pencil them to lace. They stick family photographs into helmets where the sweat will glue them to the curve. They trade ridiculous rumors, General this, Admiral that, because rumors are cheaper than prayer and both help. Some shave badly with salt water. One writes the day's date in machine oil on a boot sole. And in Berlin, men reassure each other with the smoothness of practiced liars, telling themselves bedtime stories, that the enemy is clumsy, that Sardinia will be expensive for the Allies, that Greece is safe as a booby trap if staffed correctly. The Führer, whose moods move armies like a child moving toy soldiers, and who hasn't slept properly in a decade, pronounces that the Balkans are the key, His generals nod, because nodding is, this late in the war, the shortest distance between dinner and bed. Their staff officers pencil hard orders with hands they cannot admit are shaking. When the invasion finally falls on Sicily in July, night, then dawn turning bloodless gray to red today, the beaches behave like beaches always behave under enormous stress. Waves do not read orders. Sand does not care. Men climb down cargo nets into boats that rock cruelly, and then climb out of boats into water that hides holes and holds onto trousers. They shout to be heard, and are not. They find mates by shoulder patches, by accents, by the fact that someone you know always runs toward where you should be going. The first machine gun nests open their iron mouths and are fed until silent. The first tank bogs. The second learns from the first. A boy from Ohio says mama, and then kills a man with a face like his barber's. But within hours, and hours are kingdoms in this kind of work, the line of steel meant to meet them is thinner than a similar line would have been if Pam had never written a letter. At an airfield outside Catania, mechanics wait for planes that were sent east. At a fort above Gila, a captain stares at a map and wonders why a regiment that should be here is not. Somewhere inland, a road clogs with trucks asked to do what trains used to do, and the colonel in charge of the convoy curses a point on a map named Larissa. Sicily, for days and then weeks, becomes the wrong answer to Berlin's right question, and the right answer to London's long gamble. NPAM remains a fiction. The men who wrote her words never meet and never tell. The bank manager's pompous letter is filed in a cabinet that will smell like dust and secrets until the building is torn down for a coffee shop with poor chairs. Major William Martin rests under the white stone of Huelva, a cross shining when sunlight behaves, a star when the sky is sullen. Tourists pass and learn his name before learning it is not his. They walk away holding two truths at once without dropping either: that he did not live the life described for him, and that his death purchased time for men who did. Here is the part that never gets quoted on memorials but ought to live in the margins. The men who lied did not lie for glory. They lied because they understood that bullets are expensive, and blood is expensive, and both cost more than typewriter ribbons. They lied so that boys who couldn't grow a mustache could grow old. They lied like craftsmen, not like poets, though in the morning of victory they allowed themselves a grin into a teacup and the sentence, "Well, that seems to have worked." NIF, you put your ear to the inside of history and listen. This is the heartbeat you hear under the drums and anthems, the small, careful noises of people building a lie sturdy enough to carry the truth across a sea. Then that is where we pause, with ships inbound and a beach receiving the first arguments of the day in fire and iron, and in Berlin a phone ringing on a desk. We pause with a wallet drying in a Spanish office, the lipstick kiss gone faint at the edges, a letter folded and refolded until the fibers learn the geometry of war. We pause with Pam smiling from a photograph at someone who never lived and saving the lives of men who did. NWE will pick up there, on the beaches, in the war rooms, in the offices where postures had to change faster than reputations, when the dust clears enough to see what a single body, a handful of letters, and a well-timed tide actually bought. NFOR now carry the image: a quiet morgue, a careful suit, a sea that pretends to be innocent, and a deception that made victory look like good fortune when it... Higgins boats nosed into the shallows, metal mouths opening to spill men, crates, and fear. The invasion that planners had drawn with rulers and erasers was now happening at the speed of breath. Waves slapped the flanks of boats with a sound like hands against a drum. Engines coughed. Boats grounded. Ramps crashed down. And in the first seconds, the terrible arithmetic began. Who stood? Who fell? Who went forward anyway? Non-shore. Some sand was empty where it should not have been. That was the first dividend of a lie. Pilots, who might have banked in to rake the water, were east, waiting for ghosts over Greece. Artillery tubes that might have been trained on the surf line had been collared and pointed elsewhere by officers with good reputations and the wrong orders. The deception had not removed danger. It had moved it, stretched it thinner, pushed it to places where it could do less in the first hour, which is the hour an invasion either survives or does not. Infantry splashed off ramps and stumbled into a world that smelled like salt, gasoline, and cordite. An American sergeant from Kansas shouted himself hoarse, trying to herd his squad toward a low stone wall that had outlived 5 centuries and was willing to host one more war. A British corporal from Birmingham carried a radio like a wounded animal and swore with love at it until it decided to work in this new climate. A sailor on a beaching craft kicked at a jammed coil of rope like a man punishing time. Over everything, the sky did what skies do, pretended neutrality while keeping score. And a deception is not a spell, it is scaffolding. And what the men found beyond the first sandbar was a pattern of resistance with seams. A machine gun nest that should have been tripled was single. A reserve company that should have been here was 6 hours away on a road that had already decided to be intolerant of trucks. An airstrip that should have been a hornet's nest was a shrug. The fight was still a fight. Stone chips sprang. Men digging foxholes with their bare hands because shovels are slower than fear. Medics drawing rectangles in the sand around bodies they would come back to. But the edges of the fight were forgiving in ways no plan has the right to expect. A young lieutenant, face ash white under sunburn, took a prisoner who smelled of cheap cigarettes and resigned discipline. The prisoner had a pocket map. On it, the lieutenant saw units that shouldn't be where they were. He sent the map backward with a runner who had not yet learned how to carry his head low. Hours later, in a tent 2 ridgelines away, a colonel traced the same map with a blunt finger and realized that either the enemy had become suddenly incompetent or something had led them away. He didn't know about the icebox in London. He didn't need to. He only needed the gap, Natsea, the flagship's radio room, hot as a bakery and twice as frantic, received fragments that formed a curve. Support ships moved closer than they liked because the line on shore, ragged but stubborn, asked them to. Offshore guns mumbled their deep language, shells arcing to bruise stone. Naval officers watched through binoculars and tried to pretend their throats were not tight. They counted landing craft returning empty and landing craft not returning at all. They counted smoke plumes and told themselves smoke is not always bad news. In London, in a room where the clocks all told different truths because time zones are a kind of conflict, signals trickled in from the quiet factories of intelligence. Traffic analysis from Athens, Luftwaffe chatter from the Peloponnese. Orders reassigning units to islands just far enough from Sicily to be irrelevant to the day. A woman in a cardigan drew arrows on grease paper overlays and did not smile, not even when an arrow that had been a worry yesterday became a blessing today. Across the hall, a man who'd argued for the operation in the first place allowed himself 3 words into his cold tea. It took. Then he put his cup down and went back to work. No one there was allowed to be romantic about success. There were other lies to plan, other truths to protect. In Madrid, men who had worn unbothered expressions for decades began to choose their words more carefully. The diplomat who had slipped a wallet into the right hands now slipped out of conversations earlier than usual. The German attaches, who had bathed in a warm tub of their own certainty, felt the water cool and insisted it was still hot. In Berlin, reports arrived with the petulant tone of facts that had been promised a different ending. Someone had to tell someone with medals that the enemy did not choose Greece for the main blow today. And because pride is a better storyteller than evidence, they said the enemy had been clever, not that they themselves had been misled by a body and a kiss. But the war is fought by people who don't read communiques. It is fought by men like the private from Ohio who crawled to the lip of a ditch and found, within arm's reach, a Sicilian fig leaf trembling from concussions as if it could be made to applaud. He had been told by a sergeant that success would mean surviving the first day. He had not been told that success could also mean fewer machine guns pointing at him because somewhere, months ago, 2 tired men in a basement chose the right brand of matchbook to put in a dead man's pocket. He would never know that detail. He would only live inside its consequence. NBY nightfall on the first day. The beachhead held in places and sagged in others, which is how beachheads behave when they're honest. The counterattacks came, teeth bared. Armor gnashed. Infantry tested the seams. On one road, a German tank platoon came forward and found its own air cover absent because its instructions were written by men who had scribbled the Balkans in the margin of their minds. On another, an Italian regiment with excellent posture and poor morale decided that, under these circumstances, retreat was a clarifying philosophy. The Allies bled. So did the defenders. But the geometry of the battlefield favored ships feeding men into the line faster than the enemy could arrive to greet them. That geometry had been tilted, slightly but decisively, by papers that had crossed a sea disguised as rubbish and grief. Far from the beaches, in a Spanish cemetery scented with rosemary and dust, a funeral finished. The priest's final syllables turned to quiet that wasn't quite silence, because the living always rustle near the dead. The headstone would say, Major William Martin, Royal Marines. It would say the date and the manner of his death. It would not say the truth. Yet that stone would gather flowers fresh enough to belong to real grief, and sometimes a folded note placed under a pebble. Thank you. The Welshman beneath the soil, unrecognized in his original name, recognized in the outcome he had not asked to influence, became an instrument of peace by an instrument of war. There are men who wanted medals and didn't deserve them. You didn't want one and got something stranger. A life invented to save lives that were very real. NTHE weeks that followed were not tidy. They never are. Sicily fought hard for itself. Towns with names that tasted like wine became coordinates. The roads were bad on purpose. Dust rose to claim the lungs of men and clung to everything. The heat punished decisions as much as mistakes. But the early momentum never reversed. What had been shifted in the first days could not be shifted back by later clarity. The enemy realized, finally, that they had believed what they wanted to believe, and by then the cost of that want was already written on too many walls and hillsides. Nat Allied headquarters, a report was compiled in language that could be read aloud without embarrassing itself. Enemy dispositions in Greece and Sardinia materially weakened Sicily defenses in the critical initial period. Not poetry, exactly, a line fit for the minutes of a committee that had no time for adjectives. It was what the liars in the basement had hoped someone would someday write. It didn't sound like glory. It sounded like a door unlocking. And back in London, the department that had called itself, with an inside joke, by a letter rather than a name, boxed up the remnants of its performances and labeled them with care. The matchbooks, the fake invoice from a tailor, the love letters from Pam. They fingerprinted their own fiction for the last time and placed it where secrets go to wait for archivists and the long thaw of classification. The men involved moved on, some to other schemes, some to other fronts, some to their beds, where sleep was an ambush and woke them as roughly as enemies. They did not write memoirs yet. They spoke in pubs only to men who already knew, and even then only after a second pint. The best deceptions are shy in peacetime. NTHE Germans performed their own after-action autopsies with the solemnity of surgeons in a museum. They discovered that Madrid had been a conduit. They discovered that seals had been lifted and resealed with skill. They discovered that the enemy had been irresponsible enough to carry operational letters by air with a single courier and a single briefcase. And, crucially, they discovered they had been credulous because they had wanted the world to arrange itself around their favorite theory. This is a form of vanity with uniforms. Some wrote angry memoranda to each other. Others wrote angrier notes to men they could not safely blame. One wrote a line that, had it been published on a wall, might have saved lives in every war since. We are not defeated by the enemy. We are defeated by the shape of our own certainty. What of Pam? She never existed and still continues to. Her letters, read forensically by men who knew nothing about love and everything about plausible patterns, did their work as well as any division. A lipstick stain can be more convincing than an armada if placed correctly. In the years since, Pam has become a ghost who does good work. She teaches cadets and case officers that the enemy has a human appetite for the ordinary, and that feeding it is sometimes the most moral act. The immoral job of war allows. What of Major William Martin? He has a service number, a grave, and an annual visit in which a flag is folded and unfolded with a respect that begins as choreography and ends as prayer. Eventually, the world will learn the name that had been hidden, and the story will acquire a new ache, a man poor in life, borrowed in death, who saved men rich in futures. The moral math will never balance, war accounts never do, but the imbalance is bearable when the living lean their weight in the right direction. Then Sicily? It fell, as islands fall, under a mix of pressure and persuasion, one port at a time, one ridge at a time, one whitewashed farmhouse at a time. Its door kicked open, then kicked closed again by a soldier, careful not to break what he didn't have to. The campaign became another stepping stone across a sea that had always pretended to be a highway. The lie that enabled the landing became one of many lines on a chart that led, by cruel detours and necessary cruelties, to an ending in which the guns finally ran out of reasons to speak. If you are looking for a tidy lesson, here is one the story offers and that history reluctantly endorses. Some victories are born not from force, but from the careful placement of doubt. The men who arranged this doubt did it with paper, spit, and audacity, and then they trusted human nature to finish their sentence. They did not ask for applause. They asked for results and got them at a discount in blood. NIF. You are looking for something to carry away in your pocket. Carry this. A matchbook matters if it sits in the right pocket at the right time. A life invented with tenderness can rescue many lives that would otherwise have ended without ceremony. And a tide that comes in on schedule can pull more than seaweed and driftwood. Sometimes it pulls history itself a few degrees toward mercy. NSO. Let us end where the story began. In a small room, late, with two men deciding exactly which creases a letter should have to look like it has been loved. Let us end at the sea, where a stretcher tilts and the body enters a narrative he did not audition for. Let us end on a beach where young men, many of whom could not grow proper mustaches, do brave, ordinary things behind the screen that those letters bought for them. And let us end at a grave in Huelva, where a stone carries a name that did its job, and a truth that took a long time to arrive. When people say the invasion of Sicily succeeded because of courage and logistics, they are correct. When they say it succeeded because of weather and luck, they are not wrong. But if they neglect to say it also succeeded because of a lie, told so well it became a temporary truth, then they have left out the thread that holds the story's weight. War would go on. More ships would load. More beaches would be asked to accept men and the metal they carried. More rooms would brew tea over maps. More letters would be written and never posted. Deception would perform again in bigger theaters, with more props. Armies that weren't armies, radios that talked to themselves, inflatable tanks posing patiently under reconnaissance cameras. But the heart of the craft would remain the same. Understand what your enemy wants to believe, and give it to him with fingerprints and lipstick he can test and trust. Close your eyes and you can hear the icebox hum again. You can smell the paper and the glue. You can feel the roughness of cheap envelope stock and the smoothness of a photograph's gloss. You can hear a tide in Spain, regular as breathing, and boots in Sicily, irregular as hope. Between them, a distance traveled by a wallet. And if you open your eyes, you will see the quiet people who made it happen, sitting at the edges of victory, pouring tea into chipped cups and not saying much, because what they had to say they already put into a dead man's pockets and sent to sea. NTHAT is where the story resolves. A lie crafted to spare the living, a beachhead that held, a grave tended in sunlight, and a single practical truth that outlasts uniforms and slogans. And sometimes, the straightest path to saving lives is the crooked line you draw through the enemy's certainty. And fade on surf becoming background, boots becoming footsteps, and the soft click of an empty teacup set down on a file stamped closed.